And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you for joining me today and to remind you to connect with us on Facebook, where our community keeps on growing. And if you love what we're doing, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, and get exclusive access to bonus content. That's patreon.com/realtime1960s. And today, we continue our examination of the top 10 films of 1965. On 3 previous episodes, we covered films 10 through 8, The Sons of Katie Elder, Pierrot Le Fou, and Repulsion. And today, we move on to films 7 and 6. So without further ado, the best of 65 at the movies, right now. And my 7th ranked film is The Flight of the Phoenix, a disaster film based on the 1964 novel of the same name by Elliston Trevor. The story follows a group of men trying to survive in the Sahara after their cargo plane's emergency landing is forced by a major sandstorm. Out of radio contact, and with just 12 days' worth of water and pitted dates, their only food, the men ultimately try to create a workable plane out of the wreckage, with major personality clashes along the way, and a major twist as well. Directed by Robert Aldrich, not one of his more financially successful efforts, certainly not compared to later films like The Dirty Dozen and The Longest Yard, the film's ensemble cast includes James Stewart as the pilot, Richard Attenborough as Stewart's loyal but alcoholic second-in-command, Peter Finch and Ronald Fraser as a stiff upper-lip British Army captain and cynical sergeant respectively, Hardy Kruger as an arrogant West German aeronautical engineer, Ernest Borgnine as a just-fired oil worker suffering from a nervous breakdown, and George Kennedy, Ian Bannon, Christian Marquand, and Dan Duryea in far less prominent roles, which is really too bad, because those are all very good actors. So no women in the cast, you'll notice, and some have attributed the film's commercial failure to this fact. I don't. I'm sure it didn't help, but, Lawrence of Arabia and The Great Escape had no female speaking roles either, and those films did just fine. So I'll explain a little later my own theory as to why this film, despite good reviews, did not draw audiences. Shooting commenced in California in April of '65 and wrapped in August, a remarkably smooth production with one horrific exception, the death of stunt pilot Paul Mantz, a stand-in for Stewart, who was killed when his plane went out of control as the cameras rolled. There's a brief on-screen dedication to Mantz at the end, but footage of the crash was not included in the film, although I hear it can be found on YouTube. Now, The Flight of the Phoenix is not a great film, but it's a solid film that held my attention throughout, and it made my list because it contains underlying themes of interest. The film's energy derives from the developing rivalry and generational clash between the pilot, Stewart, who was rooted in older, more human-centered traditions, with a very American kind of freewheeling, adaptable approach to his craft, and Kruger, the young German engineer, cold, analytical, data-driven, and a bit contemptuous of human frailty. So the question is posed, in the face of this disaster, which worldview will prevail? And though there's no doubt about which type of man Aldrich was, he was squarely in the Stewart camp as a maverick and strong proponent of learning through experience, which he did himself in Hollywood, in earlier stints as assistant director to men like Chaplin, Renoir, and Louis Milestone, as opposed to the generation just sprouting up in Hollywood in the 60s, with young directors like Coppola and Spielberg, products of film schools. But despite Aldrich's personal leanings, the resolution of the conflict in the film does not proceed exactly as one might expect, which was a pleasant surprise. And the twist, which I won't reveal, revolving around the Kruger character's background, also surprised me. So yes, a disaster film, but not of the genre-bound, cookie-cutter variety. Now, an interesting subtext is the fact that Stewart had been a decorated Air Force bomber pilot in the European theater of World War II, the first major movie star to enlist, actually, and ultimately was promoted to full colonel. If you can, you should watch the brilliant documentary The World at War, a British production released in the 70s, in which Stewart is among many veterans interviewed about his wartime experiences. But at the same time, 20 years before this film was shot, teenage Hardy Kruger, the child of ardent Nazis, was first a member of the Hitler Youth, then a student at the elite Adolf Hitler School, and finally was assigned to an infantry division of the Waffen-SS. Toward the end of the war, he refused an order to shoot at an American squad and was sentenced to death for cowardice, but the order was apparently countermanded. This was his own recollection. I'm not sure if it was documented, but he later said that this marked his break with Nazism. But this history, which was acknowledged between the two men, did not lead to any serious tension on the set, but it does add some heat to several arguments between these two characters, centered on the theme of humanity versus efficiency. Now, this was by no means the first disaster film. There had been several lesser ones in the 50s. A Night to Remember from 58, about the sinking of the Titanic, and then two aviation ones with John Wayne, The High and the Mighty, and a second one that's almost a frozen version of this one, Island in the Sky, in which Wayne's plane is forced into an emergency landing in Canada. But of course, the heyday of the genre was the 70s, when apparently casting directors looked at The Flight of the Phoenix as a kind of ideal talent pool. Stewart was the lead in Airport 77, Borgnine had a big role in The Poseidon Adventure, and George Kennedy was the king of the 70s disaster films, the only actor to appear in all 4 airport films, and he also appeared in Earthquake. Now, what's interesting about the 70s disaster films is that despite the cynicism of the Vietnam Watergate era, those films had heroes. Burt Lancaster in the first airport movie, Gene Hackman certainly in The Poseidon Adventure, Steve McQueen and Paul Newman in The Towering Inferno, whereas here there are no heroes, just varying shades of gray. Both lead characters have virtues and weaknesses. In other words, they're human, which is why I think it failed at the box office. It's not a feel-good action movie, which most of them, including the 70s ones, ultimately are in the end. Films like The Towering Inferno appear to be apocalyptic, but they aren't really in a philosophical sense. What they generally represent is a recovery of strength and human connection in the face of existential crisis. That doesn't really happen here, at least not to any great extent. Aldrich was maybe a little more cynical about how people actually behave in such circumstances. For example, the cynical British Army Sergeant Watson fakes injury when his commanding officer, Peter Finch, courageously but foolishly resolves to head off into the desert to seek assistance, a mission with a minuscule chance of success. And Watson later pretends not to see Finch when Finch wanders back from the desert severely injured and collapses, because Watson would apparently rather let Finch die than be reprimanded or even shot for cowardice for his previous fakery, which has been exposed by Stewart in the meantime. But Watson is not reprimanded by Aldrich necessarily. His cowardice, or cynicism at least, actually ends up paying off for him, as such actions sometimes do in life, and he's not portrayed especially negatively. So that's new, and very 60s, at least mid to late 60s. In the 40s and 50s, and maybe even in the 70s, such a character would have been punished somehow. At another point, Stewart himself goes off into the desert to try to recover Borgnine, who has sneaked out of camp to follow Finch. It's somewhat reminiscent of Peter O'Toole going back into the desert to rescue an Arab associate in Lawrence of Arabia. But whereas there, O'Toole returns successfully to great acclaim, Stewart returns with empty hands and a severely burned face. The makeup, by the way, is very good in this film. Aldrich seems to have taken an almost perverse pleasure in making old-time Hollywood icons like Bette Davis and Joan Crawford in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and Stewart here, look warped or malformed. And the acting in the film, with the exception of Borgnine, who's a little over the top, is excellent. Stewart, to me, was the best of his generation of heroic leading men. Just had more range than Wayne or Cooper or Clark Gable, none of whom could have pulled off what Stewart did in Vertigo, for example, or even in It's a Wonderful Life. But here, Stewart really thrives in this unusually eclectic ensemble featuring some excellent European actors like Kruger and Peter Finch. Maybe that brought out his competitive instincts, but Stewart brings heat and nuance to what turned out to be one of his last major lead roles. All right, moving on to film number 6, The Cincinnati Kid, directed by Norman Jewison and starring Steve McQueen, with other roles filled by the great Edward G. Robinson, Anne Margaret, Tuesday Weld, Carl Malden, and Rip Torn. Shot in New Orleans between December of '64 and March of '65, the film takes place in the 30s and deals with a gifted stud poker player nicknamed The Kid, played by McQueen, who was actually 34 when this film was shot, who, as the film begins, is seeking a showdown with the cold, calculating Lancey Howard, the longtime champion known as The Man, played by Robinson. Now, the film's original director was Sam Peckinpah, who would later direct McQueen in back-to-back films in the 70s, but Peckinpah, in what became a running theme of his career, clashed with the studio. He was determined, among other things, to shoot the film in black and white, with MGM objecting with unassailable logic, in my view, that in a film dealing with card playing, the blacks and the reds had to be clearly differentiated. But Peckinpah would not budge, so he was fired, and Jewison's compromise to capture that 30s look was to shoot the film in muted colors. Big mistake, in my opinion. To me, the desaturation does not make it look like the Great Depression, it just makes it look depressing, like a bad print. You know, if you look at Bonnie and Clyde or Chinatown, both of which also take place in the 30s, the colors are very bright, but the brilliant costumes, hairstyles, and sets make both very period appropriate. Now, another issue, and this was noted by critics back in '65, are the many parallels between this film and The Hustler, released in '61, where you had a similar, cocky up-and-comer with character flaws, the pool shark played by Paul Newman, who was also on a collision course with an established, cynical pro played by Jackie Gleason. In both films, you have pure skill and artistry corrupted by malevolent outside forces. In The Hustler, that force is gangster George C. Scott. Here, the wealthy, amoral Slade, the Rip Torn character, who, after getting totally gutted by Robinson in a poker match early in the film, seeks to avenge that humiliation by fixing the McQueen-Robinson match in McQueen's favor, unbeknownst to McQueen. Another parallel, both Newman and McQueen are forced to choose between their ambition on the one hand and women who love them on the other. Piper Laurie in The Hustler, Tuesday Weld here. So, in general, The Cincinnati Kid suffers by these comparisons. Just not as compelling as The Hustler, and frankly, poker is just not as cinematic as pool. But the strength of the film lies in the McQueen-Robinson interplay. There's a scene during a break from their marathon match, which takes up the final third of the film, where Robinson, who's presented as an almost satanic figure with this tight little beard, the first time you see him, he's getting off a train in a cloud of smoke. But in this scene, he just kind of bores in on McQueen, needling, probing for any weakness in the kid's psychology. And of course, there's a subtext of the old established actor versus the up-and-comer. And McQueen, having watched Robinson as a kid at Saturday matinees back in Slater, Missouri, was nervous about this film. He knew that Robinson was more than capable of stealing the picture. But they ended up getting along quite well, and Robinson was very complimentary. Here's what he said after the film was released, quote, "This young man comes out of the tradition of Gable, Bogart, Cagney, and even me, playing the sort of roles that we used to play, but adding his own dimension. McQueen is a stunner, and I have a lot of respect for his talent." So, very kind words. And Robinson was also proud of his own excellent performance in this film, which he considered his best, and which launched a comeback of sorts, which continued until his death in 1973. Now, there was friction between McQueen and Malden, entirely generated by McQueen, I should say, who had some pretty deep insecurities and anger issues as well. Malden plays a dealer named Shooter, who was tormented by his promiscuous younger wife, played by Anne Margaret, and blackmailed by Rip Torn into helping throw the match. And Malden, like Paul Newman, against whom McQueen had a separate kind of internal vendetta for years, was one of the nicest, most unassuming guys in Hollywood. Not a single enemy to be found. But there's a scene in a hotel room where McQueen accuses Malden of throwing the match, which Malden initially denies. And then, out of nowhere, McQueen just explodes. He grabs the larger man and slams him into a wall, hard, which was not in the script but remains in the film. You can see the surprise and even some fear flash onto Malden's face. So after they cut, Malden kind of touched McQueen's shoulder from behind, as if to say, are we all right here? And McQueen really turned on him, snarling, "Don't ever touch me." Now, one thought I had reading about that incident, people who suffered abuse as children, as McQueen did, often do not like to be touched, especially by men and especially from behind. I once knew someone who had been physically abused as a child, not by his father or stepfather, as McQueen was, but by an older brother for whom that was the case. But Malden was unable to diffuse McQueen's anger, and he finally learned the truth from an agent at William Morris, who told him that when he, Malden, had been a casting director back in the 50s, he had rejected McQueen for a role in the play Tea and Sympathy, which Malden did not even remember. But McQueen had held on to this all these years, either as motivation or just a facet of his own insecurity. But he did eventually smooth his relations with Malden, as he did with Newman when they worked together on The Towering Inferno, where the two stars got along just fine. There was no past incident there. That was more just a rivalry, at least in McQueen's mind. But Malden, when he was later asked about this grudge that McQueen had held over this Tea and Sympathy rejection, he kind of made light of it. But then he said, "I still say he wasn't right for the part." So that's good. But if you set aside the kind of senseless desaturation and the fact that even highly charismatic actors sitting around a table playing poker is just not cinematic, the Cincinnati Kid can be appreciated as a further development of McQueen's King of Cool persona. But again, as a film, what makes it stand out for me is the excellent McQueen-Robinson interplay. And despite the critics' unfavorable comparisons to The Hustler, with which I basically agree, this was a big box office success in '65 and the beginning of a major hit streak for McQueen, the first of 5 films he released between '65 and '68 that just killed it at the box office and established him as a bona fide star and icon of the '60s. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1965. So take care, and I'll see you soon.